Hello, grade 7s. This week we're going to learn about the consequences of the 7 Years' War, or as the Americans like to call it, the French and Indian War. So we've learned about this major conflict that happened in the 1750s and 1760s. How did that help shape Canada as a country or where we live today? That's what the focus of today's lesson is going to be. Remember, last week we learned about the causes of the war or what started the war, and you'll recall that it was Great Britain versus France in an epic struggle for economic dominance in the fur trade and in other natural resources. And you'll also remember that there was this big four-way struggle for control over the Ohio Valley. French wanted it, the British wanted it, the First Nations people wanted it, and the 13 colonies, which is another word for or another name for the British colony in America, wanted it as well. So the war happened. You'll recall that the British took over Quebec City and they won the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And so what happens next? The consequences of the war, what impact did they have? In the short term, meaning like right away, what happened was there was something called the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris was signed in France, and it was an agreement that basically said, okay, we're going to stop this war between Great Britain and France. It also said that Great Britain was the winner. In the long term, or some of the long-term consequences that lasted for even till to this day in 2020, something called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which basically established that the Ohio Valley was going to be taken over by the British, but sort of saved for an Indian reserve for First Nations people to live on. This was sort of also a sneaky plan to stop American expansion. We'll talk about that later. There was another long-term consequence, which was that Treaty of Niagara, 1764, where the British said that they would continue to work peacefully with the First Nations and they would continue to give them gifts and they would leave them alone as long as the sun shone, the grass grew, and the British wore redcoats. We'll find out later how that goes. Okay, let's first talk about the short term, the Treaty of Paris. So they decided to redraw the map when they signed the treaty. And you'll see that this big sort of orangey section in the middle is land given to Britain. This is the Ohio Valley here. This is the 13 colonies to the east. This is your British colony that existed in America, present day America. They were British people for the most part, but we'll find out later in the lesson that they weren't so happy with how Great Britain was running things in North America. The Treaty of Paris just essentially said that the war would end, there would be peace, and Great Britain was the winner. So if Great Britain is the winner and France no longer owns this new colony that they had, or New France, so what are we going to change the name to? This name of New France is then changed to, can you take a guess? If you guessed British North America, you would be right. So the French people still lived in Quebec and they still lived in Nova Scotia, and there was still a lot of French colonists living in North America or present-day Canada, but no longer would France be the owner or the controller or the ruler of this vast territory. It was now the property of the British Crown or the British King or Queen. That's a huge shift because now the British are in control and they make the rules. They set the laws. They are the ones in charge. moving forward. On the long-term end of things, the Treaty of Paris would have a long-term effect because now that the British own British North America, they had to begin a policy of assimilation to try to force the French people to change. And we'll talk about that at the end of the lesson. Another long-term consequence of the war is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So in this official document, the British proclaimed ownership of British North America, and they also promised land to the First Nations in the Ohio Valley. And we're also going to investigate how that worked out. So a quick reminder here, you've got the 13 colonies here, and they are a British colony, but they're they're growing very quickly, and they want to grow westward. They want to grow this way. But the British Crown wants to slow that down because they want to sort of have the most impact on how things happen. And the 13 colonies are starting to become more and more independent and more vocal. And so when the British signed this Royal Proclamation of 1763, they sort of had this sneaky plan where they would give the Ohio Valley, this big section of like yellow in the middle of your map, to the First Nations people as a way to stop these people in the 13 colonies from moving this way. They set it up as what they called an Indian Reserve in 1763. But as time went on, it seems from that map that maybe that was a good thing for the First Nations people, but as time went on, the British decided more and more that they wanted nothing to do with the First Nations. And they betrayed their alliances with the First Nations and blocked their ability to trade. There was a British governor general named Geoffrey Amherst, and he wanted to get rid of their alliances with the indigenous people. This was kind of a betrayal because the First Nations, especially the Iroquois, had supported the British in the 7 Years' War, and they had fought alongside them. And now that the war's over, the British are sort of betraying them and turning their backs on them. And the First Nations people were not happy with that. And so this chief, who's pictured here, a chief of the Odawa Nation by the name of Obwandigag or Pontiac, he forms a secret alliance of the First Nations in order to form a new army or a new force to fight back against the British for this awful betrayal. And he's trying to forge a military alliance in secret with other First Nations people. And I want to ask you, what do you think he did to do that? Because you can't text, you can't email, and if you move around the country to try and find allies, it's going to raise suspicion. So what's a good way to get your message out secretly, almost like a spy message, during this time of war? What if I told you that they used an article of clothing? Do you think that would be possible? Let's find out. Let's learn about something called a wampum belt. A wampum belt is a handmade beaded belt, and they were used as symbols. Often they represented formal agreements that have been decided upon, sort of like a contract that you might sign today with Bell or Rogers for your cell phone plan. They were also used as secret messages by chiefs who were secretly organizing against the British during Pontiac's rebellion. So that's how they kind of got the message out. And then the Treaty of Paris that I meant, that should say the Treaty of Niagara. The Treaty of Niagara, let me fix that. In 1764, This is actually the Treaty of Niagara that was symbolized in this wampum belt that I've got pictured. You got two people holding hands in peace and harmony. Remember, I mentioned that the British said, "Oh yeah, yeah, as long as the sun shines and the grass is growing, the British will not assault you, or they will not turn their backs on you." That is what this is. This wampum belt was a special creation that commemorated that promise. Gift giving and promises were very, very important in First Nations culture at this time because remember, they did not have a written language. So you couldn't write down the terms of an agreement or a contract. Instead, your word was your bond. So truth was very important. Being truthful and signing an oath or swearing an oath was very, very important. They tried to document these agreements in the form of a wampum belt, and that was how that's how they made agreements. And later on, when the British would betray these agreements, the British could easily turn around and say, well, we have nothing in writing. And the First Nations people would say, well, we didn't write it down, but we still had an agreement. So what do you guys think? Do you think it's fair to make a promise or an oath to a friend but then turn your back on that promise simply because it was not written down? That's some interesting food for thought for you. Anyway, let's continue. This is what one of the Ojibwe chiefs said to the British after he had learned about this betrayal. He said, "Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to no one." In other words, we will not give them up to anyone. "Englishmen, our father, the King of France, employed our young men to make war upon your nation. In this warfare, many of them have been killed, and it is our custom to retaliate until such time as the spirits of the slain are satisfied." In other words, what he's saying is, this is our land. The Ohio Valley is our land. North America is our land. The French, tricked us into fighting with them against you, and we will retaliate until we are satisfied. And that sort of, this primary source gives us a really unique indication into how some of the First Nation chiefs might have been feeling, and also would help us to understand why Pontiac decided to start his rebellion or his secret war against the British. Here's a painting that happened just outside a fort called Fort Michilimackinac. Fort Michilimackinac is located in northern Ontario, up here where my mouse pointer is, and is right on the border across from Michigan. Not only is it an interesting fort, there's two different really cool history stories that I love to teach students about this fort. The first one will be today, and the second one will be when we learn about the War of 1812. And on top of that, it's also a really cool name to say. I want you to practice trying to say it a few times. Fort Michilimackinac. And anyway, so here we are in the red arrow in GTA, and it's located pretty far away, but still in Ontario. So it's a British fort. You've got a lot of cannons, guns, and British soldiers inside. And Pontiac and a few of his buddies are outside coming up with a secret plan. They decided one day to tell the British that they were going to bring hundreds of First Nations people to play a game of lacrosse outside the fort. The British were like, okay, fine, you can play your game of lacrosse here, no problem. Remember, lacrosse was actually a First Nations invention, and it is Canada's national sport. So for for the First Nations people to ask to play a game of lacrosse outside the fort was not totally out of the ordinary here. It's not like a random thing. It's something that they would have been playing often. So the British agree. Hundreds of First Nations people show up, men show up to play the game, but secretly they were there to actually attack the fort. And so after they started playing the game, they dropped their lacrosse sticks, pick up their weapons, and attack the fort. The British were pretty upset about this, and they were kind of brainstorming ideas of how to get back at the First Nations people for this betrayal. They were having a hard time putting down Pontiac's rebellion. Remember, the First Nations used guerrilla warfare tactics, like this secret game of lacrosse, which was actually a secret invasion. The British were not used to that kind of warfare. They were used to lining up on the battlefield and shooting at each other in an honorable, gentlemanly sort of way. The British start to turn their eyes towards more evil strategies, including using smallpox. So, smallpox is a deadly virus that can be easily spread. Here's a picture of a person who actually had smallpox, and if you look carefully, you can see how badly her skin is blistered and sort of like chickenpox, but way worse, and it will essentially kill you. They didn't have modern medicine at the time, so people had a hard time fighting smallpox. It was like COVID-19. It would spread very quickly, and it was very, very dangerous, and there was no vaccine at the time. So sort of similar to what we're experiencing today. Now, the British people, they wouldn't necessarily die from smallpox or be affected by smallpox because they had an immunity to it living with other people in Europe, back in Europe. They had sort of developed an immunity. Remember, if your body fights a virus or an infection once in your lifetime, chances are it has a good opportunity to not get infected by it a second time because you build immunity. Because smallpox came from Europe, the First Nations people throughout their many generations had never been exposed to smallpox. So, therefore, their bodies had zero immunity. And therefore, if a First Nations community got smallpox, it would be extremely devastating, and a lot of people would die from it. And so, this Governor General, Jeffrey Amherst, the one I told you about who wanted to get rid of the alliance with the Indigenous people, he had this evil plan, which was to take infected blankets that people who had the smallpox before and give it to the First Nations people as a sign of peace. And he knew that that would be an effective attack using germ warfare. In other words, the First Nations people would accept this gift of the blanket, not realizing what they had done, not realizing that the blankets had the virus in them, and spread them throughout the community, and therefore everybody would get smallpox, and then therefore everybody would die. Okay, let's move on to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So the Royal Proclamation was this legal document that the British Crown came up with. It, number one, proclaimed ownership of British North America for the British. Number two, it gave Great Britain promised this land and they gave it to the First Nations in the Ohio Valley. This upset the Americans in the 13 colonies because it was a very sneaky plan by the British to keep the Americans out of the Ohio Valley. At this time, during the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Crown declared that First Nations people can only acquire and sell land through treaties with the British Crown. In other words, they were not able to buy or sell property like a normal citizen. This was actually taking freedoms away from Indigenous people, and it was also part of a sneaky plan to prevent the Indigenous people from selling land to those scary Americans to the south. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a second and say the treaties this whole idea of coming up with treaties to trade land with the First Nations people, this is a huge, huge, huge one. This is what's going to impact policy making with the First Nations and Indigenous people for all the way up till 2020. Okay? So back in 1763, this decision was made, and this still has a huge impact on First Nations people today in Canada, which has led to the reasons why First Nations people still live in reserves that are, um, you know, in poor conditions. That's where that all started from, this document. And let's move on to the fourth point. The proclamation seems to protect Indigenous territory, but inside the document it also states that the British Crown is always the owner and controller of the land, and can make deals with the land anytime it pleases. Which, yeah, I put some question marks there. That should raise some red flags for you. In other words, what do you mean you're giving somebody land, but you're not actually giving them ownership of it? And again, the same graphic map here. This huge area in yellow in the middle, that's the Ohio Valley. It's huge. It's a lot of land. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of natural resources. I don't think the British ever had the intention of actually giving it to the First Nations. Part of me wants to believe that the British did this as a way of stopping Pontiac's rebellion, of keeping the First Nations people happy and quiet for a short period, but actually would lead to a massive, massive betrayal. You might be asking yourself, what about the French people in Quebec? We talked about them earlier. Well, after the Treaty of Paris, Britain owns New France. The French live in British North America. What is life like going to be? What is life going to be like for them? A French Catholic living in a country or a colony that is controlled by a Protestant English speaking majority. Well, Quebec was French, and the population was 90% French. And so the Royal Proclamation of 1763 tried to assimilate the French in Quebec, or in other words, it tried to slowly force them to lose their Frenchness, lose their culture, like their religion and their language, to become more English and more British. Eventually, though, the British realized that this wouldn't work. The French are pretty strongly attached to their culture, and with the population in Quebec being so heavily French, they realized that it was actually kind of dangerous because the French could easily turn around and overthrow the British there because they had more people. And so they came up with a plan to keep the French happy. 11 years later, the Great Britain monarchy passed the Quebec Act of 1774. It's really important that this Quebec Act was really important to the French because it gave legal protection to French freedoms to be Catholic, to speak French language, to use French style laws, and to continue to collect tithes, which, as you remember, are taxes that support the Catholic Church. The Quebec Act also gave away much of the Ohio Valley land to the French, making it part of the province of Quebec, therefore taking it away from the from the First Nations people. And so the Quebec Act, it would keep the French people happy, it would keep them loyal to Great Britain, but it had some very serious consequences to the South. What do you guys think that might be? Do you think that that would lead to another rebellion from the First Nations? Well, if you said more war, you were right. The Quebec Act of 1774 was the British strategy to stop the French from revolting and fighting and taking over, but actually, in an irony of history, it was one of the major reasons why America and the American colonies, the 13 colonies, would eventually revolt against the British and then gain their independence through a bloody conflict, which was the War of the American Revolution, fought between 1765 and 1783. Eventually, the US would win that war. Spoiler alert, sorry. The United States would win that war and become a country in 1776. It's one of the bloodiest wars in world history, and it led to one of the highest death counts in world history. And this is all leading back to the 7 Years' War um, and the Royal Proclamation, which upset the Americans, and then the Quebec Act of 1774, which further upset the Americans. And that concludes the video lesson.